But this particular one here is about, if I don't do a good job, I just...
Just a reminder.
This is one right here. The reason I bring this up is for twofold. This is one of the very few places, I was reading it this morning, one of the very few places we run into an imprecatory prayer. And this is the prayer that you see of the tribulational martyrs when they're underneath the throne of God in Revelation. And they're speaking to God to revenge themselves, for God to revenge them against the Antichrist. And you don't see too many imprecatory prayers. You don't see them in our time because theologically we are not allowed to pray them, strange as that sounds. But this is one that Jeremiah had. And it's a really good one because I think that we are in a time that's similar to the time of Jeremiah. And you see it happening and will happen and continue to happen, is that Christianity is going to be persecuted in this country. Where if 20 years ago you went back, you couldn't find anything but people saying good things about Christians. Because reality is that Christianity may have its faults, but its goals are always to do what is right and good. Okay? Imprecatory prayers are the prayers that where Jeremiah is being persecuted very, very specifically very specifically for a very specific time. If you remember this particular time, this is just before the fifth cycle of discipline takes place to the Israel in 586. And these are the priests and the people of the church of Israel, not church really, but and their leadership actually going against Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is the speaker for God. So it's a very interesting thing that takes place here. And I bring it up to you because verse 18 is a part that I think is actually taking place right now. The imprecatory part that comes afterwards, 19 through the rest of it, is just interesting. You know, it's interesting to see what happens. So I want to just read a little bit. We're actually going to talk about it next week. I don't want to take our time here, but we'll talk about. We'll set something up, and like maybe the beginning of the class, we'll have 10 minutes to kind of let people come in from choir and things like that. Gives you a little more settlement time, if that makes sense. So the part in 18 is interesting here. Excuse me. Is that they said, come, let's make plans. What happens before this is Jeremiah speaks to them from the Lord. That starts in like verse 13. But the other part that says, they said, these are the leaders and the priests and people like that in this time. This is around 596, something like that, some of the territory, BC. And he says, come, let's make plans against Jeremiah for teaching the law by the priest will not be lost, and the counsel from the wise, nor the words of the prophets. Some come, let's go attack him with our tongues and pay no attention to anything he says. Now, what they're saying there is that Jeremiah says that he speaks for God. And these are the false prophets and people going against him that are in Israel. And what they're doing is they're saying to him, here's something, let's speak against Jeremiah. Because if we do that, it will not harm the law of the prophets. It will not harm the things that we learn from the Word of God. They're really saying that he does not speak for God. That's what that really means. And it means that he is, even though he is the true teacher from God at this time, especially to Israel, there's actually three of them, Daniel, Ezekiel, and him. But he's speaking the truth to them to help them turn back. Help them to turn back to God. It's a really interesting time because what Jeremiah is telling them to do is he is telling them to not resist Nebuchadnezzar. Very interesting point of view. Most people would look at that and think that was actually some sort of treason. But if you know history and you remember some of the stuff from Daniel that we talked about years ago, you see that the best protection for Israel at this time is actually being under the Chaldean Empire, where Nebuchadnezzar will protect them. If you remember the very first visit Nebuchadnezzar went out there, he saw the city of Jerusalem and just thought it was the most beautiful thing, and he wanted to be part of it. He actually wanted to protect it, and that's what he did from Pharaoh Necho. So if you remember this particular piece, so he's speaking for God. He is trying to get the people to go back. Now, this particular time in the temple, they're doing things like child sacrifices. They're doing all kinds of awful idolatry, which you find in the book of Ezekiel. But so he is God's man, and not only is he speaking for God and trying to direct the people the right way, both the leadership, if you remember, that was Kenaiah and Zedekiah, and that is this particular time. He's trying to get them to come back. And what's happening is that the people who are the priests and the people of the priesthood and the rulers are speaking against him. And they're actually saying, he doesn't speak for God. The prophecy he says are never going to happen. We're going to be delivered from Nebuchadnezzar. Well, we all know that Nebuchadnezzar kicks their butt. But that's the purpose of it, and that's where he's going. What it shows you is that when you speak for God in times like this, and we are in times like this, in my opinion, is that when you speak for God, you will have people who are believers who will ridicule you, who will actually say you do not speak for God, even though you do, even though you take the words off the Word of God itself. So it's an interesting time where he's at, and I think it's a similar time for where Christians are at. You know, reality is that we have not obeyed God's laws, and because we have not done that, we are in the situation in this country we are in. Okay? The reality is that Christianity is not being spoken properly. The rules are very straightforward. God is not politically correct, contrary to belief. And the interesting part, the second part, is actually the imprecatory prayers. So we'll do those next week. But if you have a chance to read it, verse 18 is about him. You can read before that in the chapter. But after that is the actual imprecatory prayers, which you don't see very often, and they're kind of interesting. So on that, let's move on to the Bible study. So I thought we'd spend this, if people can get here at 8:20, we can spend 10 minutes just talking about that.